Hi, I'm Janice Child, and I wanted to share a short video on how you will be citing sources um, in this week's discussions, specifically the one involving Amy Krauss Rosenthal and the other one, Anne Lamott. So here goes. And as a preliminary bit of information, I want to talk about why we cite sources. The first thing we want to do is avoid the possibility that someone thinks that you plagiarized, that you took the ideas or the words or the images or the graphs or the statistics or whatever from someone else and didn't credit them. Instead, you passed it off as your own work. Sometimes this happens by mistake, and that's always sad. Sometimes it's just that we're rushed to do things. Sometimes it's because we're discouraged from citing sources. I know when I started working in marketing for an insurance company. The guy I worked with to develop brochures and sales materials liked to look at other companies' brochures and sales materials and kind of copy what he liked. And he said there was no point in reinventing the wheel. And that was theft. And it was appalling. And there you go. So there's my dirty little secret. I went along. Anyway, it's wrong to plagiarize. Plagiarizing is stealing. The second point, and maybe it's more important, is that the more credible your source is, the more credible you'll be. If you use information from a highly credible source and argue and use that source to support your position, then by virtue of the credibility of your source, your position becomes more credible. So what happens if you don't cite your sources? Oh, there are all sorts of things that can happen. In the insurance company, nothing happened. Just a lot of guilt later on. I'm kidding. But if you're in school, certainly lots of things can happen. You can fail the assignment, you can fail the semester, you can be expelled. I used to work at a school where we had an ethics officer, and if you thought that a student plagiarized, she would have a meeting with the student, and then she would make the student write an essay on what plagiarism is and why it's wrong. And if she felt that the student was unlikely to learn the appropriate lesson, she would have that student's essay on plagiarism provided to subsequent instructors. So all instructors would know that the kid cheated at least once. And here's another thing that happens, and I'll tell you from my perspective. When I think that someone is plagiarizing, and I think that it's intentional, it changes my opinion of the student. I'm always on the lookout for plagiarism from that student moving on. And that's a horrible position to be in. It's horrible for the student, and it's equally horrible for me. It's horrible to think that I don't trust someone and that is coloring my approach to their work. So where do you cite your sources? There are two places where you cite sources. The first place really is the exact spot in the work where you use that source. And this is a minor in terms of the amount of information you provide citation. And it points directly to a more extensive citation on the references page, which is the page that follows your essay or your work. So what does it look like? The references page information you might want to create first. And for the Amy Krauss Rosenthal example, it will include the author's name, the date of publication, the title of work, the publisher, and the complete URL so that the reader can get to that exact space. the references page is organized alphabetically. So if you have an article by Smith, an article by Babbitt, and an article by Washington, the Krauss-Rosenthal reference will come after Babbitt and before Washington. So it's alphabetical by whatever appears first. And the references page is set up with a hanging indent. And so the first line comes to the left margin, and the second and the third and the fourth and however many lines you have is indented just a little bit in. There's a way to do this in Microsoft Word, and it's fairly easy, and I will show you how to do that once I'm sure I've figured out how to use this Make a Movie software. So here we go. So this is NightSight. NightSight was developed by a grad student at Calvin University many years ago. So he's probably gone, but the Calvin's library keeps it up to date. And I think that they are using the 7th edition of the APA style. And as you can see in the left column, you can pick from MLA, APA, or Chicago. When you click on either of these, then the fields that are required changes. And so here we're in the APA, and if you click on any of these options, the fields that are required changes. So you fill in the fields that the software requires. You select the kind of work you're referencing, and you fill in the blanks. It's pretty easy. Then you click Submit. So in this case, I have a normal article. The other options would be editorial or opinion, or the number of authors. 1, if I selected 2, there'd be another line of for you to fill in the other authors' names, the title, the publisher, the date of publication, and I failed to put in the exact day, but when you do it, it will provide that information to the reader too. Do you want to include the URL? Yes, please do that. Having the complete URL makes it that much easier for me as your reader to click through and get to the source that you're using. If you just put in New York Times, I would have to do a search for the article. It would slow me down. I'd get cranky. So anyway, provide the complete URL, at least in this class. And no, I did not use a database for this. And then hit Submit. And what happens when you hit Submit? It provides the reference page citation set up with the hanging indent. As you can see, your reader would look for Krauss-Rosenthal, and that Krauss just hangs out at the left margin and makes it easy for them to find it. So you can copy and paste that. And the first thing listed is the author's last name. And so we're going to keep this in mind when we create the internal citation. We want to point specifically to the author's name. And the other thing that's important is the date, and that's why they put it second. And the order is typically, as I mentioned before, last name, initials, year, month, day, title of the article. And look at the red section in the above the First and the Midwest and below the citation itself. It tells you that the APA has a specific way of capitalizing the information in their titles. And only the first word after a colon, and proper nouns are capitalized. Publisher for newspaper articles is in italics and then retrieved from the complete URL. Sometimes certainly in newspaper articles, often on web pages, but if it's a corporate web page or a university web page, chances are good they don't provide a date. But often things are corrected after they're first published, and you want to use the last date. So if, for for example, this Amy Krauss Rosenthal article had no date. You would put Krauss Rosenthal, comma, A period, and then in the parentheses you'd put no date, or N period, D period, lowercase, N period, D period, close parentheses, period. And then in the retrieved from information, you would put the date that you retrieved the information, the date you looked at the article. And why is that? If we're looking at something that could have been altered between the time you looked at it and the time I look at it, and I find something different, and I think you're making stuff up, I won't if you tell me the date you looked at it and it was much before the date I looked at it, because I realize that things change or can change. So always look for the last date. Sometimes the updated information appears at the top of the article. Sometimes it appears at the bottom. Sometimes the date's at the bottom. There's nothing standard about this. So just pay attention to these things. And also, another thing that might appear at the bottom is the name of the author. So always look for an author. So here we are back at Amy Krauss Rosenthal, and we're writing our essay, and we're going to use our internal citation. And we want to use it at the point that we reference Amy Krauss Rosenthal's article. And we want to include whatever appears first in the references page citation. And we want to include the date of publication. And if it's a print publication, we want to include the page numbers. Okay, so later on, when we look at the Lamotte example, you might find the information on page 62. And then you would include that bit of information in the internal citation. So there are two ways to do the internal citation. One is to make it part of the sentence. So here's my example. Amy Krauss Rosenthal, 2017, writes, "Allow me to introduce you to the gentleman of this article, Jason Brian Rosenthal. He's an easy man to fall in love with. I did it in one day." That's nice. And what do we know? We know that I should be looking on the references page for Krauss Rosenthal and 2017. So I look at your alphabetical list and try and find that source. The second way of doing your internal citation is to put it all in parentheses at the end of your use of the article. And so I'm writing, "It's through the details that we learn what is so lovable about Jason, his socks, his ability to cook, his thoughtful gifts, and his appreciation for great music." And then in parentheses before the period, I put Krauss Rosenthal, comma, 2017, close parentheses, period. And that tells my reader to look for Krauss Rosenthal at the left margin on the references page to find the exact source. So is it always like this? Oh, no. It can be different depending on the kind of source you use. If it's print, if it's an anthology, if it's a journal, it can be different. And so you have many resources that you can use to find the correct way to do this. So maybe the first way to do the references page is through NightSight. Or you can look in the Troika and Hesse Quick Access Reference for Writers. Chapters 27 through 29 deal with the APA. Or you can look at the APA Style Blog or the Purdue Online Writing Lab. But before we do that, let's look at your library. So this is the homepage for your library, the ADP library. And there's information here on the databases, the periodicals, the libraries, the library hours, Ask a Librarian. Always a good idea to ask a librarian. They're very helpful. But let's look at the APA and the writing papers, which is in this column here. And it'll take you to an article on what is plagiarism. And it will take you to the APA Style Central, the APA Style Guide, the Owl at Purdue and the Walden Library Writing Center. Actually, I haven't used that one, but it might be really good. So for now, let's go to the Purdue Online Writing Lab. Online Writing Lab is OWL. And the Purdue OWL used the 7th edition of the APA. And why is this important? It's important because the 7th is the most recent edition. Your book, Quick Access Reference for Writers, uses the 6th. So there might be changes between your book and now. So there's a lot of information on the APA in the Purdue OWL. Right here is a little video that probably tells you general information about the APA. But then there's all sorts of other things that you might find useful. And the Purdue OWL has information on just about everything that has to do with writing. So take your time, or make time sometime, to look at some of the things that you can learn using the Purdue OWL. Another option is the APA Style blog. And I think often the best information and the most direct information probably comes from the APA itself. And so when I was trying to decide how, as I said, maybe, I've always used the MLA style before coming to Northwood. And so when I was trying to figure out how to do the citations for works in the anthology, I struggled with it a bit because for every essay within the book, there's the original date of publication and there's the date that the anthology was published. I'm pointing you to the pages for the anthology, but which date should I use? And so I went to the APA Style blog and asked the question. In fact, I did a search for citing a work in an anthology APA. Now this is from the 6th edition, which is where I found the answer. And because I couldn't find it in the 7th, I'm including it here. So this is the answer for how to cite an anthology or collected works. So if you were citing the entire anthology, this is how you would do it. But you're not, or you're not going to be. You're going to be citing a specific work, in this case, the Lamott essay. And so further down in the explanation, they show you that you start with the author. In this case, it would be Lamott, Anne, and then the date that the anthology was published, the title of the article, the editors of the anthology, the title of the anthology. If you got it online, this would be the retrieve from information. If you got it from a print source, like you will, then you would include the city and state of where the publisher is located, the publisher's name, and then in parentheses, the original work was published in. Okay, and then within the body, you would point to the author, and you would use both dates. So, the original date of publication, the date that the anthology was published. So, easy? So, is citing in the APA style complicated? Oh, it can be. But there's nothing to memorize and no point to memorizing it, since as life changes, so does the APA. So it's best just to find resources that you trust and follow their advice. And you'll find an answer. And if you can't find an answer, I'm here to help. Okay? Okay. So thank you. And give me a minute. I have to get myself out of this video. Bye.